Turkey, Syria, Iraq and Iran have one thing in common: a large Kurdish minority that's been seeking self-determination. Ankara has consistently maintained a hard line on them throughout decades of bloody conflict.
Bölücü caniler ya kendileri silahlara veda edecekler.
President Erdogan said, if they don't lay down their arms, we will bury them with their weapons.
Terör örgütlerinin başını ezmekte kararlıyız.
He said that in December, but just a couple of months later came an offer for an agreement so pivotal it sparked fresh hopes and fears amid a great deal of uncertainty.
We don't know a lot about the flesh on the bones of this deal.
We don't know yet, behind the scene, whether the Turkish government agreed to some sort of mechanism. This is a big question mark.
The government have largely touted this as the beginning of a terror-free Turkey. But perhaps the most important question is what the Kurds get in return.
If these tens of thousands of Kurdish fighters, PKK members, are in the mountain, you want them to lay down arms. Where they go? Do they go back to Turkey?
There are hopes that once PKK fighters abandon their mountain hideouts in Iraq, peaceful life there would return.
There are thousands of villages on very fertile land that are completely abandoned because of the conflict.
But where will the pieces of this jigsaw land at a time of tectonic shifts in the region? After having explored the Kurdish struggles of the past, in this final part of the series we will look to the future and the many unknowns paving the way to the next chapter in Kurdish history. I'm Krassi Ivanova Twigg, and this is the Global Jigsaw from BBC Monitoring, where we look at the world through the lens of its media, exploring the narratives, the propaganda and the disinformation.
Радио Tehran. Мы не вторгались на территорию Украины.
Western countries are not the international community. That era has finished.
조중 두당 두 나라 최고 용도자 동지들께서는
Central to this story is the biggest militant Kurdish group, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, better known as the PKK. Here's a reminder from our colleague from BBC Persian Jiyar, a Kurd himself, that puts its significance for the Kurds in context.
The Kurds, even during Saddam Hussein, they enjoyed level of autonomy to study and use Kurdish language in educational setting. Yet in Turkey, they call them Mountain Turks. They deny the language. But I think even Turkey, much has changed. I grew up in Iran. I didn't know there are Kurds in Turkey until I left the country. It was like an iron wall. We didn't know what's going on. And I think Ocalan established PKK at the time. They affected the entire region.
Fast forward to the 1st of October 2024, when a seemingly innocuous gesture marked a new turn in Turkey's relations with the PKK. Dilay Yalcin from our Istanbul bureau was watching the fallout.
The latest attempts at a peace process with the PKK started very suddenly, actually, when Erdogan's ally, Devlet Bahçeli, the Nationalist Party leader, walked up to the pro-Kurdish party's aisle in the parliament and shook the MP's hands. This is shocking for Turkish politics because both Erdogan and Bahçeli had been saying that the pro-Kurdish party was actually an extension of the PKK. Of course, the party rejects this.
Dem Parti grup toplantısında konuşsun.
Bahçeli said Öcalan should be allowed to come to the parliament and announced that he is abolishing the PKK. Öcalan had not been seen by his lawyers or by his family for many, many years.
This was the clue that something major was about to happen. Then, after much anticipation, on the 24th of February, it did.
Silah bırakmalı ve PKK kendini feshetmelidir.
After decades of Kurdish militancy, Abdullah Öcalan, the leader of the PKK, called from his jail cell for the group to lay down arms and disband. The news was welcomed by both sides. Just a reminder, this group is proscribed as a terrorist organization by Turkey, the EU and the US.
Pro-government circles emphasized the government's aim to achieve a terror-free Turkey after 4 decades of war.
PKK terör örgütünü lağvedip silahını bıraktıktan sonra
Their coverage didn't really present the call as a result of the negotiations between the PKK and the government. It also didn't indicate a period of democratic reforms that would be launched by the government. Pro-Kurdish voices, although hailing the call as historic, have said that it was not the end of a process, but the beginning. They emphasized the need for reforms and democratization. They discussed the next steps, including the return of armed PKK fighters to civilian life, legal protections regarding Kurdish identity, and they also talked about the need for the release of prominent Kurdish figures in order to advance the process.
After decades of bloody conflict, why the sudden urge to make peace now? For those who understand Turkish politics, there's a simple explanation.
Some people have said that Erdogan wants to run for president for another term, which he cannot under the current constitution, and that he wants to change the constitution, and he has to go to a referendum, and he needs the pro-Kurdish party's votes in the parliament.
Abdullah Öcalan'la PKK'yla yapılacak olan anayasa
There were
değişikliği sürecinde
scenarios
ve sonrasında
about
yapılacak
the
olan
changing
Cumhurbaşkanlığı
circumstances in the Middle
seçiminde
East.
işbirliğini
Some
DEM
said
Parti ile
Turkey was now planning to reduce pressure on Kurdish groups in order to persuade Washington to collaborate. And there are other scenarios. One of them is, for example, that the US is planning to withdraw from the region and leave the Kurdish control areas in northern Syria as, quote-unquote, a second Israel, which means the Kurds will now be looking out for US interests in the region.
As is often the case with ongoing negotiations, Ankara has not fully revealed its cards.
The negotiations between the PKK and the government have not been public. The Kurdish demand for the recognition of their language and identity, the mayors who were arrested for terror charges, the thousands of pro-Kurdish party members who have been in jail for many years, we don't know what's going to happen to them. There have been some reports about the steps that the government is planning to take, however. One of them is providing a more free environment for Öcalan to work. Regarding the PKK members who lay down their weapons, reports have said that Turkey is going to follow a legal process based in European law, as well as a change of the anti-terror law that has been instrumental in cases against many Turkish and Kurdish dissidents.
It's not quite clear what the Kurds are getting out of this deal. Jiyar has more insight on the Kurdish concerns.
Öcalan says he believes Turkey has that potential to solve Kurdish problem. That's why he's calling on PKK. But also, PKK welcome this message. But they say Öcalan must be free. And if these tens of thousands of Kurdish fighters, PKK members, are in the mountain, you want them to lay down arms. Where they go? Do they go back to Turkey? According to Turkish law, they're going to go to prison for life. Would they do that? This is a big question mark. Öcalan called for disarmament, not just only disarm, dismantle the entire political party and rethink and joining political movement. The question is, does the Turkish government would allow that to happen?
You are listening to the Global Jigsaw from BBC Monitoring. As we've discussed in the previous two episodes, the Öcalan announcement has implications for Kurds in all four countries where they live, in Turkey, Syria, Iraq and Iran. Rojava, the semi-autonomous Kurdish entity in northern Syria, finds itself in a vulnerable position. Florence Dixon from our Middle East team watched how the PKK leader's groundbreaking announcement landed there.
It's undeniable that Öcalan has influence among Kurdish communities in Syria. You had crowds of people watching the readout of his speech. There's often flags raised with his image at all different kinds of protests. Even when the Assad government fell, people took to the streets in Kurdish majority areas with Öcalan flags. So as with the nature of Kurdish politics, it transcends these national borders.
Rojava's leaders have to tread carefully to negotiate a precarious political terrain. After the overthrow of Bashar al-Assad's regime in December, the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF, are now operating in the country under new leadership that is said to be backed by Turkey.
The SDF rejects being a PKK entity. The Syrian Kurdish leaders and the SDF commander himself denied that this directive for the PKK dissolution applied to them.
Disarming is seen as a risky enterprise.
Many people don't believe it's a time to lay down arms. That's why I went to one of this YPJ, all-female unit military camp in Al-Hasaka province. And I saw the girls were training, all of them in full US-made military gear. They were training under Commander Roxana, a 29-year-old woman with curly hair, very battle-hardened. She fought ISIS. And she said, we have fought for this. We are involved and active in every aspect of our life, social, economy, political, and even military. We're running our own affair. They ask us to lay down arms. If our rights is not respected, how do you expect us to lay down arms? We won't do that. They say if they lay down arms, there is no guarantee they can protect their people. They are suspicious at the new government in Damascus, and they are very wary of Turkish intent in that region. When Assad fall, Turkish-backed militias start attacking Kurdish region, supported by Turkish drones and fighter jets. And Turkey saw this as an opportunity to dismantle that autonomous region.
Ya da silahlarıyla birlikte Suriye topraklarına gömülecekler.
President Erdogan said, if they don't lay down their arms, we will bury them with their weapons. We do not accept that entity behind our borders. They see them as a threat to Turkish national security.
Turkey is one of the foreign powers that holds the key to Syria's future. Throughout Syria's civil war, it lent a hand to a jihadist group, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, that ended up running the northern province of Idlib. That same group is now in charge of the whole country.
It's an elephant in the room, basically, of how much influence Turkey has on HTS. HTS aren't officially Turkey-backed, but I think the future of what happens to the Kurdish-led administration depends on how much influence Turkey can wage on the new leadership in Syria.
The Kurds in Syria may feel squeezed from several sides, but they're not without leverage. They're guarding vast camps holding the remnants of the Islamic State group, a ticking time bomb no one else wants to touch.
The Kurdish authorities say there are 50,000 ISIS family members. Many of them still believe in ISIS ideology. They are kept in camps which pretty much are run and fed and supported by funds from United States and European countries. And also they said they have around 10,000 ISIS militants in prison. The Kurds say if US pull out, Turkey attack, we have to redirect our resources to the front line. And to manage this 10,000 prisoners, you need a lot of men to guard it. No country wants them back.
All of this must have been playing on the mind of Syria's interim president Ahmed al-Shara when he reached a deal with the SDF to incorporate its military and civilian infrastructure into the Syrian state.
I think the deals between the Kurdish authorities in northeast of Syria and Ahmed Shara is more about short-term shelf, to try to avoid confrontation with the Kurdish forces. And also, it is not clear what is the position of Ahmed Shara regarding the Kurdish autonomous region in Rojava. That's why possibly they are holding back to lay down arms or dissolve completely.
The idea of the US pulling its forces out of the region has been floated for years. And in the last couple of weeks, we've had reports of the US closing some of its bases in Syria.
There was around 900 US troops left after first Donald Trump administration. And then when Bashar Assad collapsed, Joe Biden administration added another 2,000. Very recently, they have cut down to half the number of the troops.
We're not involved in Syria. Syria is its own mess. They got enough messes over there. They don't need us involved in everyone.
But it doesn't seem the US entirely wants to pull out its troops and wants to be present in that part of the country because the fight against ISIS sleeper cells is still going on. One of the main reasons that Turkey hasn't launched a full-fledged war on the Kurds has been because of the United States bases in that region. And also there is a lot of back channel and negotiation on the part of U.S. administration to prevent Turkey to attack the Kurds.
The timing is really important. And if you take into consideration that the US provides the vast majority of weapons and other military backing for the SDF, which is the protection from the Turkish threat. And if that's going to be withdrawn, the SDF need to find their other security guarantee. It's also become quite clear that there were US negotiators involved in this deal, and they were putting both sides, especially the Kurdish-led side, under pressure to reach a deal.
If the US army need to pull out the troops, the Israeli government have said we should support the Kurds. And I put this question to the commander of Kurdish-led forces, SDF General Abdi, and he said, let me give you a general answer. We do not reject anyone's hand. Anybody who help us to protect our people, we welcome that hand. Israel is a very influential country in the US, in Europe, a powerful country in the region. Why shouldn't we have a relation with them?
Just like with Ocalan's deal with the Turkish government, here too it is not quite clear what the Kurds are getting out of their agreement with the new Syrian government.
Whether there is scope for any political or military semi-autonomy, we don't know about that yet. Strong motivations for the SDF and for the autonomous administration is that there would be some guarantee of Kurdish constitutional rights, and whether that's full citizenship for everyone, potentially like cultural rights, the ability to use their language. There were also big motivations for the Syrian government. The oil and gas reserves in the autonomous area. It's 30% of Syrian territory. We don't know a lot about the flesh on the bones of this deal. We've had all of these pledges for inclusivity, but still so much opacity about what their rule could really look like. But if it is something with an Islamist character, to what extent would that be imposed on these former autonomous administration areas? That could be deeply resented by many of the constituents there. The same applies to the military integration. How will the former SDF fight alongside other integrated factions, which until a few weeks ago, they were fighting on different sides? Another big question about what happens to the women's unit, the YPJ, if most likely women aren't going to be allowed to fight in the Syrian army.
Remember Roxanne, the YPJ commander Jiyar spoke to? She is not impressed by the new government's claims of diversity and inclusion.
She said, why defense minister shouldn't be a woman? Why shouldn't be? And I think that's a kind of rhetoric might have an audience in other parts of Syria as well.
The government she is dissing is that of Ahmed al-Shara, who was the subject of our very first episode. He was known as Abu Mohammed al-Jolani in his jihadist days, but now wears a suit. Jiyar conveys what many Kurds think of al-Shara's government.
Almost all of them are Sunni Muslim. Almost 99% of them men, just one woman appointed in this cabinet. And she's advocating for Sharia law, not for women's rights. Then we go to the Kurdish region. Women have a pivotal role in their day-to-day life, what's happening in the society. I just can't get my head around it, how these two philosophies could live together.
Most Syrians wouldn't feel affiliated to this government, even if they were Sunni Arab. I think people feel slightly underwhelmed in terms of how inclusive the new cabinet has been, but I do think there's a lot of goodwill from the different sides.
Al-Shara does have his fans. Florence has been watching state media changing allegiance.
Syrian media has become almost unanimously supportive of the new government, which I think is both a mix of different media outlets trying to kind of align themselves close to the new government and to the new leadership, and some degree of fear of how they will implement media controls or restrictions.
أحمد حسين الشرع الرئيس العشرين لسوريا في مرحلتها الانتقالية التي تلت ثورة أنهت حكم الأسد والبعث.
The SDF deal is one of al-Shara's first achievements as a statesman, which went down well in both Kurdish and Arabic media. According to them, both sides came out as winners.
In the non-Kurdish Syrian media, it was seen really positively and as a big win for the new government. It reported popular celebrations across the country, and these media outlets were really pushing for framing it as a big national aim, is to have a united Syria. If you look at Kurdish Syrian media, it was also framed as a major gain by key Kurdish figures and leaders, which makes it clear that they're still very committed to a deal.
Generally, Syrian media hasn't been sympathetic towards Rojava and the Kurds.
There's definitely a sense that the autonomous administration should integrate, and there's definitely resentment about the Kurdish-led administration's control over the oil resources, especially as the economy in the rest of Syria is really struggling, and that's obviously the biggest driver of popular sentiment. You have a lot of power cuts and electricity shortages, and a lot of that is scapegoated onto that. Kurds holding the oil back in the Assad times, that was their device when there were any domestic problems that the US and the US mercenaries, i.e. the SDF, were taking all of Syria's oil out of the country.
What's the implication? Because we were talking in a previous episode about Rojava being this blueprint for how Syria could be run. Is there not a danger that it will be kind of taken over?
There's very much a danger. It's almost certain that it won't hold the same degree of autonomy that it did. What's become apparent is that there will be a push for federalism by a coalition of the different Kurdish parties in Syria, and that would be a demand likely for some regional autonomy and also regional security forces.
Crossing the border eastwards into Iraq, you'll find the Kurdistan Regional Government, also known as the KRG. Here, armed outposts of PKK fighters are tucked away in the Zagros Mountains on the border with Turkey. The PKK and the KRG may be both Kurdish, but they don't often see eye to eye, as we discussed in our previous episode. Mohammed Al-Jumaily, BBC Monitoring's Iraq expert, was gauging the reaction to Öcalan's announcement.
Kurdish parties welcome this call, they're fully in support of it, but there's still murmurings about how this will play out on the ground. Will the PKK start to move their presence? Turkey has about 100 bases in northern Iraq. Will they start to pull out as well? These are all kind of questions that are still a bit up in the air.
It's a heavily militarized area, dotted with PKK and Turkish armed outposts, where Öcalan's message seems to have landed with one side only, as Dilay observed.
As a response to the letter, the PKK has announced that it was starting a unilateral ceasefire as of the 1st of March. But apparently, Turkey has not announced a ceasefire from its side. The PKK has announced on the 6th of March that in the last 3 days, the Turkish military had staged over 800 attacks against PKK positions in Iraqi Kurdistan.
I see occasional videos coming out from that region, Turkey bombing some areas. It seems the war is going on. I think that's why the Kurdish leadership there in the PKK, they believe Turkey is not sincere. And the PKK claim the bombardment still continue. Drone attacks, the shelling is continued. And very recently in Iraqi Kurdistan media, I saw videos, some of the villages, there has been a fighting.
I was going to ask you, how easy is it to verify these reports? These are difficult to penetrate areas.
A lot of people are simply living in that area. They see the bombing, they see the shelling. If it's safe, I'm pretty sure many journalists would go up to the mountain to see them and talk to them.
As you can imagine, Iraq considers the presence of Turkish boots on its soil a violation of its sovereignty. Jiyar tried to check the PKK's response to this whole situation.
We all, as a journalist, we wanted to know what would be the reaction of the military commanders of PKK in the mountain. I asked them if we could have an interview. They said the situation is so dire, no doubt you will be killed or our leader will be killed because drone is over our head. And I said, is it possible to have an interview via Skype or online on the phone? They said they were extremely worried about electronic surveillance. And that's why I have to send my questions. Somebody took the notes and they record his response. And it took a good 5-6 weeks to get back the answers. They say the situation of Abdullah Ocalan must be improved. He must be released and be able to lead this transition from armed groups to a political movement. And they are willing to lay down arms.
If all these conditions are met, it could lead to the demilitarization of this area.
There is hope in Kurdistan that this would lead to a pacification of those lands. There are thousands of villages on very fertile land that are completely abandoned because of the conflict. Anything that allows for people to be able to farm those areas and so on, and for life to go back to those areas, that's obviously something that Kurdistan regional government would welcome. The issue really is who's going to be manning the border between Iraq and Turkey. Again, these are very rugged terrain, very hard to establish real military control. It's only really the PKK and Turkey who really run those areas on the ground.
At this point in time, Kurdish groups in Syria and Iraq don't seem to be ready to disarm. Perhaps it won't come as a surprise that there is a similar mood among Iran's Kurds too. Our colleague Sarbas Nazari comes from the region.
The statement by Ocalan has been, I would say, cautiously welcomed by the Kurdish groups. They're taking this wait-and-see approach to see how exactly this will unfold. But they have not specified whether they will follow suit by dropping their arms. And here's another point that I need to mention is about PJAK, which is a direct offshoot of the PKK. In fact, I would say the Iranian branch of the PKK. They have also not specified whether they will abandon arms, but they have welcomed the decision, and they have, of course, conditioned the whole situation on the promise for Ocalan to be freed. All these depend on the calculations and what the next steps by the Turkish government would be.
With so many pieces of the jigsaw still up in the air, what do our experts make of the prospects for peace for the Kurds?
This is perhaps the closest we have been to peace between the PKK and the Turkish state. But skeptics say the process needs an increased democratization in Turkish politics, as well as a change in the implementation of the anti-terror law. Kurdish voices are warning that the resentment in the Kurdish youth is very similar to that of the early 80s, when the PKK took up arms against the state. Prominent Kurdish politician Ahmet Türk has famously said that the ground for talks is disappearing in the new Kurdish generation. He has said that this is the last Kurdish generation that the Turkish state is going to be able to talk to and bring peace to Turkey.
So many of the outstanding issues hinge on so many variables inside the country. The security and stability of Syria itself, that's going through this huge transition with all these different armed groups, all meant to be integrating. But again, these continued threats of reprisal attacks, lingering animosity, potential insurgencies, it's all very uncertain. The fate of the Kurds will definitely be impacted by the extent of the US involvement. And then you have the extent of Turkish influence over the Syrian government, who, if it was up to them, they would want any political and military power of the Kurdish-led groups diminished as much as possible.
If you talk to any Kurdish leader, they really yearn for a state of their own. Because they say, if a state of Israel could protect the Jew, why not for the Kurds? Many believe strongly it is only having a state could protect them. We have the chemical attack on Kurds in Iraq by Saddam Hussein. We had a massacre of Kurdish Alawite in Turkey by Ataturk, the leader of Turkey. There was a massacre of the Kurds in Syria. Bashar al-Assad didn't recognize the Kurds as a part of the Arab nation. That's why many people believe deep down state of own, it will be the answer. But I think most of the political leaders of the Kurds, they know they are facing four powerful nations in the Middle East: Turkey, Syria, Iran, and Iraq. And most of the foreign policy of the major powers like United States, United Kingdom, is they don't want these borders to change. The majority of the Kurdish political parties, they don't advocate for separatism or having a state of their own. What they are struggling at this point of time for democracy.
Thank you to our guides Jiyar, Dilay, Yalcin, Sarbas, Nazari, Florence, Dixon, and Mohammed Al-Jumaily. This series was produced by Barry Sadid, Kriszta Satori, and me, Krassi, Ivanova, Twigg. The sound engineer is Martin Appleby, and our editor is Judy King. Thank you for giving us your time.